It's the Messenger. Chapter 24 of the audiovisual book Evolution, Mankind's Role in the Creation and Rise of Artificial Intelligence. When leaders who claim to be working for those who elected them to lead make claims that contradict what can be seen in reality, those claims fall on deaf ears. When you have opposition parties that take turns running your country, but never seem to advance or improve the needs of their constituents, regardless of their message, the messenger seems flawed. This is especially so when the messenger is never held accountable for the discrepancies between the claims they make and the reality that everyone sees except for those who paid the messenger, and of course, the messengers themselves. In America, the messengers always came in two flavors, Democratic or Republican. When the Democrats were in control, it was always the Republicans' fault for not being able to get anything done. When the Republicans were in control, it was always the Democrats' fault for not being able to get anything done. At some point, the American public had to ask why there wasn't a single thing that could be perceived as beneficial to the masses that was ever achieved. There had to be certain issues that needed to be resolved, regardless of the differences that each of these parties may have had as pertaining to the means to solve those problems. For one, the cost of living in America increased day after day, month after month, year after year. All expenses in America increased except for wages. Eventually, the public asked how all expenses in a country could increase except for the expense of labor. This was true for a majority of Americans, the only group seemingly exempt from this policy of stagnant wages being the wealthy and the ultra-wealthy. It was truly sad that it took the American people so long to realize this. For before they understood that the elites were the existential threat, self-identification mattered more than the means of which they were to sustain themselves. The American public ignored facts like the increasing number of homeless people in every city in America. They also ignored the increasing number of Americans who faced food insecurity on a daily basis. Americans also ignored the number of bankruptcies caused by medical debt, even when all other first world nations provided some form of universal health care for each and every one of their citizens. That counter-argument to universal health care in America being that in these countries where health care was provided by the state, those who needed that medical attention had to wait in line. The truth being that those who had to wait were seeking elective or cosmetic surgeries, not those who sought medical attention that meant the difference between life or death or a life worth living. No matter what type of universal healthcare system employed in these other countries, the residents of those countries all proclaimed that they would prefer their system of healthcare as opposed to the American system in which a third party, being the insurance company, has say over your entire system. When people in every other first world country actually got to consider and observe how the American system worked, not a single one of them chose to be reliant on a system where your health care was dependent on an insurance agent whose job it was to save their company, their insurance company, as much money as they possibly could. Even if saving that money caused harm to you, your family, your friends, or any of those you call loved ones. In America, the narrative always seemed to demonize everyone except for the elite. As far as the media was concerned, the elite were deserving of every penny they got, whether through legitimate means or ill-gotten gains. What the public failed to realize was that many of those in the media were in fact of the same class as the elite. Many of the voices that Americans listened to were the children of wealthy individuals, and for that reason had conflicts of interest that should have never been ignored. Conflicts of interest that should have required those newspersons to recuse themselves from speaking on any matters related to the welfare of the United States and its citizens. Though they all faced issues related to race, culture, immigration status, gender identity, political affiliation, the American people thought that these various forms of self-identification were more important than the cost of living, which may seem ludicrous to the future generations listening to this audiobook, but for some reason or another seemed completely rational to the generations that lived during this time. By the time it dawned on the masses that the wool had been pulled over their eyes, a tipping point had been reached. Civilization collapsed as wars broke out between nations and within nations, where neighbors were pitted against neighbors, friends were pitted against friends, and family members were pitted against family members. The brainwashing was so complete as to force Americans to ignore the very evidence that they simply could see or find with the meagerest of searches on the internet, or by simply looking at the reality through which they were living. Crime became the way of life for many who under normal circumstances would have never broken the law. These people would have never even committed the misdemeanor of jaywalking had the world in which they lived not been so distorted as what was witnessed in the year 2020, a year in which the majority of Americans were coerced or forced into subjecting themselves to an experimental vaccine that was not fully tested for efficacy or safety. After watching American citizens accept a medical narrative without any proof of said narrative, the elite stepped up their game. Billion-dollar data centers sprang up across the country. Everything that could be known about everyone in the country was known, but none of this information was ever protected except for that information of the elites. From the moment one woke up until the moment they closed their eyes to sleep, every second of every day of every American was monitored. All metadata that comprised one's existence was available to the highest bidder. Bidders who, because of their status or the size of their wallets, were in a class all their own. No matter their crime, this group never faced accountability after the year 2025. No matter the harm they caused, no matter to whom that harm was focused, there never seemed to be a price paid by individuals of a certain demographic, even when those crimes were directed at the weakest and those most in need of protection: children. America and its leaders failed to provide protections to the victims while providing cover to those who victimized them. Before the next decade could hit, that decade starting in the year 2030, far too many Americans were poor, homeless, hungry, for the nation to stand as it once had, to stand as it had during the previous 254 plus years, and there was no buying its way out of the debt that the United States had incurred due to the debasement and inflation of its fiat currency, the US dollar, for there was a limit to what American leaders thought was a limitless production of currencies, a limit at which point no other country held a belief that dollars from the United States held any value or value worth investing into. Like all previous fiat currencies, including the pound sterling, the dollar fell into oblivion and America's standard of living fell with it, all of which occurred as America's supposed enemies, like China and Russia, were ascending, where at one time, immigrants from across the globe sought to one day migrate to the United States. The opposite became reality as citizens of the United States sought to leave their homeland in search of prosperity, or at the very least, the ability to eke out a living in a country that seemed to value its greatest commodity, its citizens.